This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Coming to you live from the Outer Banks in North Carolina. That would be the state of North Carolina, yes. That is not exactly close to Southeast Asia. Only a hop, skip, and a jump, though. Well, not exactly. It's 20 hours in the air, 2 flights. Well, maybe 18 hours to be on the more truthful side. But coming to you this September 2023, I'd like to give you a little bit of a reach back to my archives and 2 of my favorite episodes. 1, a Nobel Prize winner. 1, a performance coach. Again, if you can't learn something from these 2 men, if you can't learn something from these conversations, if you don't learn something, then you're already God. You already have the $1 billion. You've already made it. But for the vast majority of us, I guarantee you, there is something. There is a nugget. There is an experience. There is a share. There is a tell that will help you to be more successful in your life, guaranteed. Without any further delay from me, like I said, let's jump into a Nobel Prize winner and a performance coach. I hope you enjoy. For the last 18 months, everyone has been touched by a global pandemic. I'm very fortunate today to have onto my podcast the 7th Nobel Prize winner to appear. The first Nobel Prize winner to appear on this podcast who won his prize in biology. My guest today is the renowned biologist Paul Nurse, and he has spent his career revealing how living cells work. His new book, What is Life? He takes up that challenge of describing what it means to be alive in a way that all of us can understand. This is one of those conversations that I live for. I did not expect to have such a great conversation. I mean, Paul's a Nobel Prize winner. That means he's probably got a lot of good stuff going on. But this was a super fun conversation with a super smart guy. Look, we all know today that biology and science, in many ways, has become politicized. I've got my political point of view. Paul has his political point of view. But guess what? His book is not politics. His book is biology. And this global pandemic that we're all living in, it's about biology. Now, behind the scenes, maybe there's some politics about how it happened, and all that's great. But our conversation today is about biology. Let's take us all back in time. Go back to that high school or college biology class. Then bring it forward up to speed to COVID time. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Paul Nurse. You go, I assume you're in Uganda, you're in the rainforest, you're going to study the gorillas. You're up close and personal, but there's got to be a feeling, that moment when you, one form of primate, makes eye contact with another form of primate in their natural habitat. That has got to be an amazing feeling.
In thinking about how we are related to everything else in the world, every living thing on the planet, I had a really striking experience when I was trekking in the Ugandan mountain rainforest with a guide looking for gorillas. We came across a family of gorillas, in fact, quite a big one. I think in the end, maybe as many as 28. And the guide was pointing at some of them in the trees. I wandered a little bit off. And then suddenly I was facing a massive silverback gorilla. And he was sitting on the ground looking at me. And I crouched down and was staring into his eyes. He looked at me, deep brown eyes, And I remember he put his arm out and he took hold of a little tree next to him, maybe 3 inches in diameter, maybe a little more. And with one arm just pulled it down so it was now no longer vertical, but horizontal. And I got a sense that he was trying to tell me something, that maybe he was just a little bit stronger than I was. And he stared at me and then he let it release, bing. Then he ambled over to my tree, right close, and climbed up the tree. And do you know what happened next? He urinated all over me, just putting me, I think, into my place. Now, it was actually quite a moving experience, although I could have done without pee, I have to say. It was a very interesting experience because looking at this gorilla, you just knew you were related. You sensed he knew we were related. His eyes, so deep, so thoughtful looking, staring at me. It was so clear that in some sense, we were both related and we both knew it.
I cannot profess to being a gorilla expert, but one thing, and I'm going to paraphrase this, that I think I know, is that gorillas can be sedentary. They can sit for a long time, and they still will have, if they need it on a moment's call, the muscular strength, the quickness, the movability. Whereas us humans, us Homo sapiens, if we sit around, we kind of start to degenerate. I mean, it's really interesting, right? I mean, it's quite a comparison. They kind of look like they're lounging around and oafing, but on a moment's notice, it's like, wow, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
Well, the guide certainly said these animals can really move fast if they want to. What was striking for me is he didn't move fast. He walked very slowly close to me. And again, I sensed he didn't want to frighten me. He just wanted me to be aware he was there and maybe I should be careful of him. But he didn't really want to threaten me.
It would be interesting to know if we could ask him if he knows his physical prowess is greater than yours just because he can eye you up, or has he had prior experience? How does he know he's that much better? It's probably pretty obvious, but it's an interesting question.
Well, it is, but let's be quite honest about it. I'm little, short, wimpish, and a bit fat. So I think there was absolutely no competition there in terms of physical prowess. It also should be said that these troops of gorillas were used to human beings. They were wild, of course, but they were in a reserve that was protected. The human beings they saw did not harm them, and they were conditioned to them. So it made it easier to interact with them.
Did you have any sense of the pulse quickening or the heart rate jumping up a little?
It was hot and humid, and I was sweating profusely. It wasn't simply because it was hot and humid. There were other reasons too.
Oh, I tell you what, it's such a fun place to start. We're not going to stay there for but a minute, but I think it's such an amazing experience. And I hope at some point in my lifetime to go have something similar. I just can't imagine. It must, on a certain level, even a guy like you that is in the middle of biology your entire life, to have that experience. You can't read about that in a book.
Well, you can read about it in a book because I wrote about it in a book. But what you, of course, mean is that you need the experience to really know what it was like. And I did want to communicate it, largely just to introduce the notion that we are all part of a tree of life. We all have some commonalities and connections. It's a reason to respect the entire biosphere and all the animal and plant and fungal life that inhabits it. They're all, in a sense, our relatives, which is a point I made as well.
You share your story in your book about the butterfly as your start. I know 6 or 7 years old, perhaps. I think I was maybe 11 or 12, and my uncle in Southern Virginia took me out on a canoe along the James River. Very steep cliffs. We probably weren't supposed to be doing what we were doing. I think there's very expensive houses at the top of the cliffs. But anyways, we were kind of rambling around because he had found a megalodon tooth. We just started poking around on these cliffs like 5-6 meters up. Lo and behold, we found, 10 vertebrae that kept reducing down in size, starting with the size of a basketball. I don't know if it was a shark or a whale or whatnot. It was really an amazing time to be Mr. Archaeologist right then and there pulling them out. The sad story is my uncle in his infinite wisdom decided that he wanted to leave these outside in his home to be displayed. 25 years later, they're now like balsa wood. They lost all of that great fossil, so.
Well, fossils are great, aren't they? In England, I'm speaking from London here. In England, we have a part of the coast in the southern part of England, which is called Jurassic Coast, because it is a brilliant 10, 20 miles of coastline for finding fossils from the Jurassic and closely located geological time periods. It was where some of the very, very first fossils were discovered, or 1800s, including this fish dinosaur, the ichthyosaur, for example. You just wander down the beach. I'm a scientist. I take my lab away on a retreat and we go down there. When we're not working, we go along the beach and just pick up fossils, the ammonites and all other life forms of that type. It's just wonderful, isn't it? You look at these objects and they're hundreds of millions of years old, and we are looking back at life 200 million years ago. Amazing, absolutely amazing.
Years back, I had the paleontologist Jack Horner on this podcast, and he was the inspiration for the Jurassic films. Let you put your thinking cap on and get a little theoretical. You got a Nobel Prize, you're a biologist, you know a little bit more than some of us mere mortals. And I'm not being facetious, but will we ever reach a point in time, Paul, where we can do what happened in the movies? Because I want to go get my Starbucks coffee, having to dodge velociraptors. That would make my life whole.
Well, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? Trouble is, it requires DNA to survive chemically. If you want that sort of dinosaur, at least 65 million years, because that's when dinosaurs went extinct. DNA doesn't last that long, I'm afraid. It lasts longer, it has to be said, as we saw. You can still get partially intact pieces of DNA out of, for example, horses that died 1 million years ago in the permafrost, where it's been very cold. And you can sequence those. You can sequence, of course, other hominids like Neanderthal man, which are hundreds of millions of years old. But the oldest one so far is about 1 million years. Going back much further, and DNA is too unstable for us to actually get anything back. We might be able to go back to your original suggestion, we might be able not to meet the dinosaurs running around, but we could conceive of constructing something that just might possibly live from 1 million years ago. I could conceive of that. We have no way of doing it yet, but that might be possible. But 65 million years, I think, is a bridge or two too far.
Okay, I will not cry on this podcast. I will save my tears. Okay, let's bring it up to something past all of my fun subjects that are most important to me. I think I would be amiss if I did not jump into some of the issues that I think you'll have some perspective on that most of the world is dealing with right now. COVID is an amazing subject. It's brought most people into trying to understand the science. Now, they might be understanding that science through memes, through Facebook posts, through white papers, through people like yourself, through the wrong sources. I think people are genuinely curious. They really want to wrap their arms around where we are. What happened? What do you think happened initially?
Oh, dear. First of all, let me comment on the point you were making, that there's a lot of interest now for many people around the world about science, about what viruses are, about how we can combat them, how we can deal with them. I mean, I've never known a period before in my life where you can expect to find something on the news almost every day that is related to COVID, viruses, vaccines, therapies, the immune system. And it's almost endless. Of course, it's extremely important for us all, and therefore it constantly keeps coming up. But it has pushed science to a high point in the agenda, and has also introduced interesting thoughts about how we can interact most successfully between specialist scientists and our political leadership, which I think is another very interesting thing that's emerged from here, because we live in an increasingly technocratic and complicated world. We will have to deal with complex issues that are often influenced by science. And do we have the right interactions, the right ways of working that will allow us to come to sensible political decisions? Now, to the question you asked, though, which was something different, how did it all start? No expert in this area, But from what we know about the origins of new viral pathogens attack human beings, they usually are found to have jumped from another animal of some sort into humans because they've changed in some way their structure of the proteins that surround them, which influence what cells, in this case it would be human cells, they can enter. Usually for this type of virus, they come, for some reason that I have no idea why, come from bats, and they normally go through some intermediate. And that is the usual explanation people would think of for this particular one that we are all suffering from. We don't know enough about the initial infection and how it came about, but that's what most scientists think. Of course, I know there's other theories, conspiracy theories. There's also the possibilities that it escaped from a laboratory. It's not completely ruled out. It's possible that something like that happened, but it is probably far less likely than some sort of natural jump from another living thing.
You mentioned the word politics. I find it interesting to go through your background. So, okay, you have a clear political persuasion where you sit, but I've been through your book, and your book is not a political treatise. Your book is biology. I don't think there's anybody on the planet, unless they just want to be slightly off center, there's nobody on the planet that can go through your book and walk away without learning something, and it's not political. But I think you do bring up the politics in the sense that right now, in this moment in time, unfortunately, there's not enough Pauls on the TV speaking non-politically about this. What we have, at least in my estimation, is the politics ahead of everything, the politics ahead of the biology, a politics ahead of the science, the politicians just saying, trust us. Well, trust us and trust the science, but the scientific method is not about trust. It's about being a skeptic. It's about digging in and finding out. Give me your perspective. I have a sneaky suspicion it's a little bit in the same direction I just outlined.
It is. I mean, if I'm asked to talk on radio or TV, I'm asked to talk there as a scientist. I'm not there to talk about my political leanings or whatever. Obviously, these things do influence a bit how you view life, but I'm there to talk as a scientist. That's why when I write about it, you would not immediately say, oh, this guy's following a particular political position or not. I work with politicians and political leaderships of all colors, and they speak to me and interact with me because I'm a scientist. So that's clear. Now, the interaction between scientists and politicians and the public is a really, really important one, as I was hinting at just a few minutes ago, because think about our society. It is really completely, it's getting more and more complex, built on technologies that are built on science that challenges often well-established and long-established beliefs that humans have had over sometimes centuries. Science comes up with things that are a bit challenging about that. That means when we look forward to be able to come to sensible political decisions about things like this pandemic, we do have to work well with the experts, in this case, the scientists, who, as you again hinted, do not always know what the answers are, because there's a lot of skepticism. We don't know what happened. We don't quite know what this virus is going to behave like. We don't know what therapies might work. We don't know how it spreads. A lot of unknowns. Now, I've thought a lot about this because, and I think part of the problem is this: when we learn science in school, we're taught science as if it's stuff that is chiseled in granite on a stone somewhere and an unchanging truth. That is understandable, because what do we learn at school? We learn things like Newton's laws of motion, formulated about 1700, tested 1,000, 1,000,000 times over, and they work. We know that this is a good basis. And therefore, we give the idea to the public that science and scientists talk with the words of God almost. They understand everything like Newton's laws of physics, and it crosses everything that they do. They don't realize the confused fog in which scientists like me work when we're trying to understand something which we simply don't know enough about. So when this virus popped up, we virtually knew nothing about it. We didn't know where it came from, as we've already discussed. We didn't know who it would infect. We didn't know what people would be damaged and in what sorts of ways. And yet, the politicians and the public wanted instant answers. When we go on to the radio or television, scientists saying, well, we don't know this, we don't know that, it's not really what the politicians want to hear. They want to say, tell us this, and then we want nice, simple sentences to explain to everybody what's happening and what they should do. Now, it isn't like that. It just really isn't like that. There's a concept I often use of science when you're doing research, like I do. It's really a lot to do with what I call tentative knowledge. It's tentative in the sense you don't really know whether it's right. You have an idea, you test that idea. Sometimes you throw the idea away, sometimes you modify it, sometimes it survives. And over repeated testing, it gets more and more secure. Now, that sort of dynamic view of science and knowledge is not one we communicate at school. And so the public and the politicians think we know all the answers straight away. So there is a real communication issue here about what science can do and what science can't do. Now, there's an added feature to this, and that is where there is ignorance or tentative knowledge, there is also a vacuum. And that vacuum can be occupied by those who know nothing at all about anything. And that is, I'm afraid, some of our political leaders. And they can then pronounce almost anything, like maybe we should think about drinking disinfectant, because that might help counter a virus. You may have known of one very famous politician a year ago was saying exactly that. And it allows this sort of nonsense to perpetuate. And then it's picked up by social media and amplified by those who are still pretty ignorant about what's going on. And we have to really, in my view, challenge how we discuss these issues and how we come to decisions and how our politics and our political systems can generate good ways of actually dealing with it. And I would suggest this is one of the major challenges that has yet to be fully appreciated from the pandemic. But when we get through it, as I'm sure we will, we need to think how we can handle these situations better than we have done in this particular time with this particular pandemic.
Paul, do you think it's rational for the average person who's been living through this, and I've been in Asia the entire time, but the average person who's been living through this, having some experience, and I think most everybody, well, at least, I mean, I do, but I think a lot of people know somebody who's died of COVID. But given where we are now, approaching 2 years from when it was first announced in China, but given where we are right now with multiple variants popping up, seemingly a new variant that I have to know the name about every day, or not every day, it's a little bit an exaggeration, but a lot. And the fact that we have many different types of vaccines from many different types of manufacturers, is it rational for the average person, given 2 years of this, given the multiple variants and given so many different types of vaccines and a lot of people without access to a vaccine yet, is it rational to just be skeptical of everything?
No, it's not rational to be skeptical of everything. It's understandable that people get skeptical, and it's understandable they get a bit depressed about it. And it's understandable that they think, oh, let's not bother, let's go on. But there will be consequences if you do that. What I think is this: we will only solve this problem when the world is largely vaccinated. That's the bottom line. Why it's critical is where we get these variants arising, it's a consequence of evolution by natural selection, essentially. If you have a large viral load across the world because many people are infected, even though you may have vaccines that actually reduce the symptoms that you have, if the virus is still there and still copying itself, then that provides conditions when new variants will arise. New variants will actually not, by the very nature of what's happening, not be countered necessarily efficiently by the vaccine that somebody may have. Until we can get the vaccine out there and to stop variants arising because a viral load is reduced, it's always going to be a problem. We need to vaccinate the world. We need to use vaccines that are effective. And we know that some vaccines are really working. And thank goodness they are, by the way, because what would we have done if it had been like AIDS, for example, where it's been extremely difficult to get vaccines? We would be in big shit. Let's be perfectly blunt about it. There will be variants. You can't remember them, but at least we'll get to the end of the Greek alphabet. Then there'll be something else that we can call them. But the way to control variants is basically to get as many people vaccinated in the world so that actually the amount of virus spread through the world is reduced. And that's what we need to aim for.
It's a challenge because I think people, like you said, people are feeling down and depressed, and this is dragging on. I'm in a country that probably only has so far maybe 1 or 2% vaccination across the board, 100 million people. So that's not much at all. Look at countries like India, Myanmar, Indonesia, billions of people, literally. If we can't get vaccinated quickly, the variants keep popping up. When is the end here? You're saying the whole world needs to get vaccinated to stop this, but we've got a lot of people that are not for all kinds of reasons, and we keep getting the new variants. So map out how this can end. I'm sure you've thought about it.
Well, first of all, I'm no expert on it, but the vaccines do provide a way forward. Some of the vaccines, like the Oxford AstraZeneca one, is not that expensive. It may be $3 a shot, for example. Some of the more sophisticated ones are 10 times that price. But we have vaccines that could be afforded by the entire world. It's one of these situations where the entire world has got to work together. We do see that in other great problems that we face, like climate change, for example, where the world has got to work together. Now, we're not used to that. We're used to the nation state. We have those of certain political opinions, that don't want to be told what to do. So I don't want to say this is simple, but we have to go beyond the nation state. We have to work as a world together. It is possible to deliver it. Countries like India, they've vaccinated not enough, but several 100 million people. And we have to support the poorer nations, some in Southeast Asia, who have very low vaccination rates, although, of course, some of these countries did rather well, especially early on, because they were used to dealing with these viruses. But it's got to be an international effort. We haven't quite got round to that yet. And there's organizations that need to think about this, the UN, the WHO, of course. We haven't quite got round to it, but that's where we have to go. And then we have to get cheap vaccines out there, and we have to vaccinate as many as possible. We probably have to tolerate, and will have to tolerate, the virus being around for some years, like influenza. But if it's containable, then we can perhaps live with it. But what we cannot allow is large viral loads being tolerated in the planet, because it will give rise to increasing numbers of variants and we lose control. That's the fear, at least I have.
Let me take you back into the heart of your work, your book, and talk a little evolution. And I'll give a question and let you use it as a teaching moment. But one thing that intrigues me, fascinates me, as an amateur dinosaur guy, and watching all the shows and watching the evolution from the fossil record of sauropods, starting off as very small animals and then eventually getting to be the biggest, well, not, I guess the blue whales are bigger, but perhaps the biggest land animals ever, What I'm curious about, though, is your perspective on the evolution of us, where we stand right now, because obviously there's a fossil record. It's not complete, but we're able to piece together, to a large degree, how we got to where we are today. I'm curious your perspective about where we're going. If we had to roll forward 1 million years, what will we look like? Will we still be one tree of Homo sapiens? Will there be one tree that's all the size of Shaquille O'Neal? What will happen to us?
As you know, predicting the future is not a simple thing. I think that was a baseball quote, if I remember correctly.
Yogi Berra, I think, yes.
Yogi Bear, exactly. So I'm with Yogi Bear. Predicting the future, not so easy. What is interesting is that there have been many different human-like species on the planet, quite a lot in the last 1 million years. They've all gone extinct except for Homo sapiens. Some, like Neanderthal, was around up to about 30,000 years ago. We have others which were possibly around even later, we know less about. But now we have one species. Now, you ask, will there be many different variants? I don't think so. And the reason is because we don't have isolation of populations anymore. We have a mass society. It's very global. We interact with everybody. And without that isolation, there will be no speciation. And the reason that speciation can occur, that is divergence, is if you get isolated pockets of population for quite a long time in particular places. I cannot imagine that, even though we no longer have the 747 because they phased out, we have other ones like 787s, for example, which will mix us all up. I don't think we will be all mixed up. We're pretty similar genetically across the entire planet. Sequence people in different places in the world, we have very similar sequences. So I don't think that's going to happen. Another part of your question, which is the one that one can't easily answer, is given that we're all mixed up together, but will we evolve in particular ways? And that is quite difficult to answer, because what are the selective pressures under which we will be operating that could be important? And
using our phone.
Yeah, using our phones, finger agility, exactly. Diet, and how is diet going to change? There have been great and dramatic changes in the way human beings live in the last 10,000 years only, really. Now think about it. 20,000 years ago, lots of small bands of hominids, hunter-gathering, hunting something or collecting nuts or whatever. Then we had the agricultural revolution, changed our diet dramatically. Of course, we have diseases related to that, like diabetes, because our sugar has gone up. Then 5,000, 7,000 years later, urbanization, where infectious disease is going to be spreading very much more rapidly. We're still getting used to those changes that have occurred there. Now, we're going to have changes in the way we live in the coming centuries. So there may be some pressures, and I can't really predict what they might be, that could influence how we are. More interesting, and maybe what the science fiction writers like to write about, is could we extend our capabilities with prosthetic artificial intelligence type components that might increase our ability to do, I'm not quite sure what exactly. Is that possible? Well, yes, of course it's possible, because you could say driving a car is an example of it. I mean, we've extended our ability to travel faster by having a car, and it's not much the same type of thinking. So it's not quite as radical as it might sound. I mean, the way we are living today, we have extended our ability to live. The mere fact that we are talking 7,000 miles apart as if we're in the same room is an example of that. So we have many examples already where we have extended what we are, and that will continue to take place. But I wouldn't say that means a great fundamental change of us turning into some sort of android-like object. It's simply an extension of what we've done already, is I think how I would view it.
I'll be a little random on you today. So many buttons I can press with you. We're unique that we can communicate. You say this at the end of your book. You say, as far as we know, I like how you couch that. As far as we know, we're the ones that have the ability to connect like this. And so it's going to be really interesting. I guess this is another one of these prediction type questions. Be really interesting that if we can find out for sure at some point in time in the future where there is another, if it's an animal, a tree, that there is some other form of communication that we don't know about. That fascinates me.
Well, I think there are different ways of communicating. I mean, plants communicate with each other in ways that we're only just beginning to decipher, really. They communicate with volatiles, releasing chemicals into the atmosphere that can diffuse. They communicate through their roots from different trees start to touch each other. Now, there's a whole communication system going on there that we haven't got to the bottom of. And it's one of the interesting areas of biology, I would say, that we just haven't quite got to the bottom of. Where I thought you were going to go, though, and I was just going to briefly comment on, is when you were developing my sentence, as far as we know, which just shows you what sort of person I am, where I'm hedging my bets all the time, as far as we know, is do I think there will be life which is different to the life we have on this planet, which is another question of the sort that you keep asking me, of these ones that are impossible to answer, of course. But I think that is really, really interesting, and I really don't know the answer to it. And it would be absolutely fascinating to know whether there are other life forms and whether those life forms are built on the same pattern as life we have on our planet, whether it's minor variants of that or just something completely different. Those are interesting questions. Whether ever we will be able to find out is something else. I mean, if there's something in this solar system, we will find out. If it's something in another solar system and it takes light 4 million years to get to us, I think that's much tougher.
But you would not want me to just ask you easy questions. You want to have something that makes you go, oh my gosh, why is he asking me that question? Just give me the softball, right?
Yeah. I've answered everything so far in some fashion.
Here's another one that's interesting and complicated. And you brought up the life extension. So I start to think about the notion of cloning people. I don't think we are there yet, are we?
No, well, it depends quite what you mean by cloning. I mean, of course, identical twins are clones. So that happens naturally, and we shouldn't forget that. Probably what you were thinking of when you said cloning was specifically genetically modifying genes in a developing embryo at the level of an egg so that you produce a directed genetic change for some purpose. And you asked whether we're there or not. There's different steps to this. One is the ability to specifically modify particular genes. Now, we've been able to do that for about 40 years or more in simple organisms. I work with yeast. In 1980, devised ways of doing exactly that, gene editing in yeast, and others working on other simple microbes like yeast managed to do that. But the big breakthrough which extended that work was the CRISPR-Cas. It's a method that allows that type of approach to be used in all living things to modify their DNA, and including ourselves. Okay, so now, whereas before that was impossible, now we could do it. So now we could, in principle, modify the genes in a human being. Routinely, I mean, I sit here at the moment in my institute, the Francis Crick Institute in London, and people are modifying the genes of human cells in tissue culture all the time. I mean, it's now a routine method. But of course, to turn that cell into a human being is a completely different story. And now I'm going to comment on that. The first thing is to use a method which is right 99% of the time is fine if you're just doing experiments. It's absolutely not fine if you're producing modified human beings. If 1% of the time the editing, the change goes somewhere else where you didn't need to direct it, because you will damage somebody at far too high a rate. So that's one thing you've got to be sure of, that the technique you're using is very precise and is completely safe, is not yet completely in place. The second thing is you've got to know enough about the genes and how they work to know what the impact is, what the effect is of modifying a particular gene. Now, in some cases, it's relatively straightforward that you might have the gene that is defective in a disease like cystic fibrosis, where it's a very simple genetically defined disease, which if we can correct it, means that person can live normally. There's not so many diseases of that sort, but there are some. That is something that we could imagine doing, and not only could imagine doing it, but I think most people would probably be ethically okay with it because of the nature of it. That sort of technology is already being used to treat not eggs, which you would need to do if you were to clone, your initial question, but if you had a disease which was a consequence of alterations in a particular gene and you could correct them in part of your tissues or cells or your organ, then that is like a therapy. So again, I don't think people would have too much of a problem with that. I think the problem comes when the disease is complex genetically, and so you don't quite know what to do, or maybe you don't really know what to do at all. You don't know whether you will, if you hit a particular gene, whether that will have consequences that you don't understand, and that could lead to yet more problems that are not understood. It's all made more complicated because although you might be happy treating a disease, would you be happy to use it for more cosmetic purposes, like to make somebody tall or have blue eyes or blonde hair or big feet or more musical or whatever? Then it starts getting a bit uncomfortable, I think. How do we deal with all of this stuff? Which is really, I think, the important point. It goes back to the point I was making before. Technology and science will continue to impinge upon our lives in good ways, but in complex ways. And the only way to deal with it is to identify those issues early on, which are complicated, and have proper discussions about them at an early stage before they overrun you, and come to sensible decisions about how you handle them, whether you should use gene engineering of this sort, cloning, whether you shouldn't, under what circumstances you should. The mistake is to bury your head in the sand, not talk about it, and then suddenly find that all these things are possible and we don't have the ethical and moral discussions that allow us to handle it. That is part of that challenge I was talking about earlier, of getting good discussion between science, technology, or scientists and technologists, political leaders, and the public to get satisfactory answers to those questions.
I'm curious about you. I know you have an interesting family background. For everybody out there that wants to say, well, a guy like Paul, he wins the Nobel Prize, he must have a silver spoon, came from perfect situation, all that kind of fun stuff. I don't think that's your case, but I would love for you to kind of give, I know this is asking you to brag a little, but I want you to, because look, people can learn. I want you to kind of share a little bit of the story of you. What drove you? What pushed you? What was the magic that was pulling you along? I mean, the itch you had to scratch that you couldn't stop. And now here you are, you're talking to crazy me in Saigon.
You're referring to the fact, of course, although I'm a geneticist, which is what I am, I wasn't aware of my own genetics. So really, I quite advanced in my life. And when I was nearly 60 years of age, when I was working in the United States, in New York, in fact, I was refused a green card. Quite admired Homeland Security for doing that, I must admit, as I was at the time a Nobel laureate, president of a university, and knighted. And so I had quite a lot of sort of Boy Scout badges. And for them to reject me was a sort of rather heroic, I thought. But they did. And they didn't like my birth certificate. They didn't like my birth certificate because it didn't name my parents. I mean, it was a perfectly legal document that just didn't happen to name it. When I did get it, which was been sitting, of course, in the archives in London for years and years, when I did get it, or a copy of it, it revealed that my mother was not my mother. She was my grandmother, and that the person I thought was my sister was actually my mother. This is a story that happens, of course. My real mother got pregnant at 17. She was sent away to her aunt. It's like a 19th century novel. Sent away to my aunt, gave birth to me. My grandmother came up to the town where I was born and pretended to be the mother and came back. And we all lived together with my grandmother pretending to be my mother. My real mother got married, left home. I knew her, of course, but the time I was growing up, she had her own family and so on. All this was revealed when I was nearly 60 years of age, was a bit of a shock. Highly ironic, of course, that here's me who goes on about genetics all the time, and here's me not knowing my own genetics. It was sort of ironic to the extreme. My background, which is perhaps also what you're referring to, was a rather simple, poor background, really. Working class family, nobody stayed at school after 15 years of age. My grandfather could not really write properly. Yet somehow I was quite good at school, not brilliant, but quite good at school, and stayed on, went to university, blah, 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 and came out the other side as quite a successful scientist. So I did wonder all along why on earth I was different, but I never thought of what was the truth. Now, you asked, what drove me? I have an almost unhealthy curiosity about everything. I'm driven by a curiosity of wanting to know how things work, what's going on at all levels, in all sorts of subjects. I think that is the driving force. Why I have it, I don't know, but it's just wanting to know how things are and how things work. And that's been my driving force, curiosity.
The curiosity for truth.
Yes, it is.
I like to think that most people would be okay with that and would like to have that also, but maybe they're not exposed to it. So was there a reason? Is there an influence? Was there a mentor? Was there a moment that you knew you were on this? You've got the butterfly story that people can read about in the book, but was there a moment, a big moment that really pushed you down the direction of this search for truth, this curiosity to find out why?
No, I don't think there was. It's more like bricks in the wall, build it up a little bit at a time.
A little Roger Waters?
Well, yeah, something like that. I didn't have a road to Damascus change. I didn't see a flash of lightning and then suddenly all was made clear.
You just kept grinding?
I think I realized I was very curious about the world because I was younger than my brothers and sister, my mother. I was quite often alone at home with my grandparents, and they were grandparents. It wasn't hugely active at life. And I thought a lot. I looked at the world a lot. I bought a little telescope and looked at the stars. I looked at the butterflies, as you can read in the book. I just was fascinated in it all. But I didn't have a eureka moment. It just sort of, I got my children, I've got 2 grown-up daughters now. They used to say, Dad, the trouble is you're just interested in everything. Just stop it. Just stop it. I've just got a pathological curiosity. Don't know when it came, but I've always had it.
We've not figured out a way, as you know, as I know, we've not figured out a way to stop this aging process. However, I think you might agree that when you stay curious, and I like to think of myself as curious, I'm talking to you, I get to learn from you, but when you stay curious, it keeps you young at heart. I mean, I think even people listening to you right now, I think you're over 70, but the way you think, the way you talk, you know what I'm saying? There's something to that curiosity and keeping us fresh, my humble opinion.
Well, it's true. And I've had a very, very, very privileged life, coming from quite humble background. I have been paid all my life to follow that curiosity. Imagine it. I've been paid to do just that. I mean, what a privilege. They could have paid me a quarter of what they pay me, and I'd have still been perfectly happy doing it. I have PhD students here doing research. They're quicker than I am. They know lots of things. Between us, we find solutions. I have low cunning and experience. They have sharpness of mind and enthusiasm. I have enthusiasm too. It does keep me young because I'm working all the time with 20-year-olds, very smart ones too. I think you're right. Perhaps does keep you young.
Cool stuff. I appreciate you coming on today. The book everyone should check out. What is life? Understand biology in 5 steps. I really love some of the issues you brought up at the end. I'm not going to go into them all, but there was another issue you brought up. If someone's, let me see if I was going to phrase this right, certain criminal behaviors that are perhaps we can find out have something to do with that person's genetics. It really made me think. That was one of those questions where I was like, wow, that is one where the answer is not smooth. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. So I think it's a great read in that sense that you're going to cause people to pause in this busy, chaotic world where everyone thinks the latest Facebook post and 30-second TikTok video is the key to understanding. So I appreciate you reminding us all that there is a deeper path, a deeper understanding that we can go down. So that's cool stuff. I appreciate it, Paul.
Well, thank you. I wrote a very short book. I wanted to write a book that everybody could read and wouldn't get overawed by it. I go to the bookshop and I'd see all the popular science books. They all seem to be 450, 400 pages long. They all seem to sort of have a lot of words, but not necessarily a lot to say. And what I did here, I didn't think up any really good ideas. I took the really clear ideas and just explained them simply to everybody. I wasn't always trying to look over the horizon, which is what most books do, about the next big discovery. I just wanted to communicate what we really know. It'll be a book that in 30 years would still be more or less correct, I would say.
It's a good foundational basics. I mean, it's something that I've not read that type of work or thought about a lot of those issues since high school biology. It's very accessible and a pretty quick read. So I think people enjoy it.
I hope so. I hope so.
Hey, Paul, is there a place you would like to direct people beyond Amazon to buy the book? What is life? Is there a website you would like to direct people to?
I'm afraid not. I'm a bit ancient and I'm still stuck with paper and print. I struggle with the digital.
I give the compliment praising you on your youth, and then all of a sudden you fall back on the Model T explanation. I see how that works, right? Behind you is gene therapy going on. Who knows what's being done in the lab? But then all of a sudden, but listen, hey, I appreciate you coming on. Really, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation immensely. You're a great interviewer. Thank you for that.
This conversation is why I do my podcast. Now, don't get me wrong. I love all my guests, but it's one of those ones where it's something from perhaps my youth that I was always curious about. And I never expected to have a conversation with Michael Jordan's personal trainer. In fact, my guest today, his very first pro athlete client as a trainer was one Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player who has ever played. And I got to tell you, Tim has some fantastic lessons about life, even how he made his way to be at Michael Jordan's doorstep, that very first meeting. Wow. A little bit of luck, but also a lot of taking a chance, putting himself out there. And that's just how he got to Jordan. But those lessons he learned along the way, those winning lessons, he is here today to share a little with all of us. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Tim Grover. You've got about, I think looking at ages, you've got about 4 years on me. So I want to take you back in time. I'm going to go a little fishing here in the beginning. I want to take you back in time to 1982. At that point in time, I was living 15 miles from Washington, D.C. I was a rabid Georgetown fan. My father went to Georgetown, and I sure as heck did not want that team in baby blue to win down at UNC. I loved watching that guy named Michael Jordan, but I did not want that team to win. When I think back to the physical shape, and I can still remember, look, he was a young guy. He was a freshman in college, but the Michael Jordan as a freshman in college was not the one that you ended up remaking physically, huh?
In college, he was 197 pounds. After our years of work, he was all the way played between 213 and 218.
Do you remember watching that game?
Yes, of course. Everybody watched that game. I mean, there was something about him that was just, I won't say different. I think that word is used too often. There was something unique about him. And then hearing how all the different coaches described him and his work ethic and his preparation and his different mindset and his detail to the game. So it didn't surprise me the way his career ended up being, and him being able to take that shot during that moment as a freshman and make it.
Maybe you're right. Different is overused, but to win the national championship as a freshman, kind of a rare thing for people that know something about college basketball.
Yeah, and never hesitated when he took that shot. Just like, all right, here it is. Ball came to him, saw it was open, stepped into it, hit nothing but net.
When did you guys first meet up? Let's get granular and tell that story, the setup. How did it happen? Because obviously that changed your life to have that meetup, huh?
It did. No question about that. I actually started with him in 1989. He'd already been in the league, 4 or 5 years?
He had a 63-point game against the Celtics. He'd already been doing some big stuff.
Oh, he'd been doing some special stuff. I mean, listen, one of the coaches after 4 games into his rookie year said he's already the best player in the NBA. He had already been doing some special things, obviously his rookie year. And then the second year, he had the foot injury. Then he came back for the big game that you just mentioned and had a lot of individual success up to that point, but had never won the championship. I was working at a local health club during that time. My education is I have a master's degree in exercise science and a bachelor's degree in kinesiology. I always knew I wanted to train professional athletes. So there was a small article in one of the local papers saying how Michael Jordan's tired of taking a physical abuse from the Detroit Pistons. He's looking to bulk up. All right. So what I did was I was like, okay, there's no way the organization is going to hire an individual who's never worked with a professional athlete or outside to work with him. So what I did was like, all right, if I can get in with some of the other players, then there's a chance he could see my results and maybe he'd be interested somewhere down the line. So what I did was back then, remember, no emails, no text messaging, very few cell phones. They had the big ones with a backpack on them. So it wasn't the ones that fit in your pocket. So I did was I wrote 14 letters to every single player on the Chicago Bulls organization, handwritten letters, put them in a mailbox, hoping they would get to the players. So what happens is when you send letters to athletes, in that time, they get thrown in a pile of fan mail. So every athlete, if you put their name on it, somebody in the back puts them in the person's locker and say, okay, here, and then it's the athlete's decision whether they want to open it or not. Well, obviously somebody opened one of my letters. I still don't know who it was. And it was sitting in another player's locker. And Michael saw this letter in somebody else's locker and reached for it and pulled it out and told the team athletic trainer and the team physician at the time, hey, he said, find out what this person is about.
Oh, come on, really? Is that true? Come on, really?
That's how this happened.
Serendipity.
The one person I didn't send a letter to was him, because I was like, okay, it doesn't make any sense to send a letter to him because there's no way the organization is going to let me work with him. There's no way he's going to be interested in working with me. So I just said, I'm not even going to send him a letter. So then the team athletic trainer, the team doctor, both called me and they said, hey, we have somebody who's interested in your services, which was very unique because during that time, training was always kept in-house. Nobody hired anybody outside.
What was in this letter? You just stopped Michael Jordan 5 or 6 years into the league. He sees a letter randomly, doesn't know you from Adam, and he then gets the Bulls to find you. What was in this letter?
It explained who I was and what I did. And the key to the letter was, and I talk about this in the book, Winning, everybody would tell him what to think. This is what the books say. This is what's going on. Here it is, and so forth. I wrote some stuff in there on things that you wouldn't find in studies, you wouldn't find in books about training. I said, hey, listen, I have different methods, different ideas, different thoughts on how an athlete should be trained. And I just put a couple of examples in there, nothing detailed, but just a couple of things that were different than what everybody else. So obviously something in that letter caught his eye, because when you look at him now, so many years later, when you watched him play, his game wasn't just about what to think, it was how to think. He was very fluent in his movement. He really trusted his instinct. He was so well prepared. My thought process was kind of the same, not knowing that's going to be the edge that got me there. So that's, in my estimation, I've never asked him what was it about that letter. Put it another way, knowing his competitiveness, he could have been simply, why in the hell did I not get a letter? Why did everybody else get a letter, but not me? So here I'm telling you this elaborate story about what I think it is, and it could be something very simple as like, oh, what's this guy think I'm not good enough? For 3 months, we went back and forth. They put me through a bunch of practical exams, a bunch of written stuff to make sure I knew what I was doing. So 3 months time passed. I still didn't know who they were preparing me for. So then they said, hey, here's the address. We want you to go meet the client at 1:30. They still didn't tell me who it was. So they gave me the address. I went over there. This was before the big gated house. You could just walk up to the house. So I rang the doorbell once, no one answered, rang it twice, no one answered, rang it a third time. And Michael Jordan opens up the door.
Obviously, you were pretty well grounded to be writing that letter, the content of that letter, but there still must have been this interesting euphoria that you had to temper in that moment, didn't you?
Well, you know what? I'm not a starstruck person. That's the one thing. At that moment, that was very advantageous for me. Listen, I admire what they do. I know how hard they work to get to those areas, no matter what line of work they're in, but I'm not a starstruck individual. So I was just like, all right, here's an opportunity. Even though he was the one individual I did not really prepare for as well as I prepared for the other individuals. But since he was on TV so much, just like you described, there was so much emphasis put on him since that shot. So it was easy to understand and gather information about him and watch his game and what he did. So that was already kind of innate in my head to see what he needed to work on and what he didn't need to work on. He invited me in the house. Well, the first thing before I walked into the house, I had Converse gym shoes on, so we know that wasn't going to work. So I had to take those shoes off. So we went inside the house. We talked for about 45 minutes. I explained my philosophy to him, what my ideas and thoughts were. He was all about, he goes, I need to get bigger. I need to get stronger. And I was like, yeah, okay, that's down the line. These are the things we need to address right now. And he was the first individual that probably came at him and didn't allow him just to dominate the conversation and say, hey, this is what I want. And I was like, no, this is, in order for this to work, this is what we need to do. And the things I told him that were more important was, he's going, I want to be more athletic. I want to be explosive. I want to be more stronger. I want to be able to do these things. So what I said, well, you have some injuries. You have these little nagging injuries that come all the time. Your ankle injuries, groin strains, your hamstrings. I said, let's address those things. If we address those things, you'll automatically be stronger. You'll automatically be faster. You'll automatically be able to jump high. You'll automatically be a better basketball player. So imagine your body functioning at an optimum level. So he goes to me, this doesn't sound right. I said, it doesn't get any righter. I said, give me a chance. Let me prove what I can do. We never discussed money. We never discussed any of this. He goes, I'll give you 30 days. And 30 days turned into 15 years.
Of those 30 days, how many days per week were you getting?
Every single day that they had practice or a game, I was with him.
For the average Joes out there, they're kind of curious. I mean, obviously, whatever a training program you get for one of the world's greatest athletes is not going to be the average Joe training program. What did you start to do in those first 30 days that got him hooked? Was it particular exercises? Was it the mindset talk? What was it? Was it just you? What got him hooked on your direction?
What got him hooked was I told him exactly how he was going to feel and where he was going to feel things. 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, 96. I was telling him exactly, hey, this is what your mind and body is going to feel during these times. When we do this particular exercise, this is what we're going to do. This is how your body's going to feel. This is what you're going to be able to do on the court. This is what's going to be a little bit difficult here. This is the time you're going to have to adjust your shot. So all these things were laid out. It was kind of like already telling him what the future was going to be as it related to his body, so he could make the adjustments that were necessary. And when we do this exercise, you may feel here. We do this, your ankle is going to have a lot more mobility here. When we do this thing, your hips are going to open up more over here. And also the program that I did it wasn't conventional to what everybody else would do. Normally you see people in gyms and when they work out, I'm just going to use a shoulder press movement for an example. You'll always see if they have 30-pound dumbbells in one hand, they're going to have a 30-pound dumbbell in the other hand. And I would hand him different weights in different hands and have different reps for one side versus the other. Because I would say, listen, one side is already overused when you constantly play. This is the direction. So now we need to focus in more on the other side. You have a strength deficit on this side. So we need to use more weight on one side, less weight on the other side. And the same thing with his legs. So stuff that was actually still is unconventional to this day. He started to see the results quickly. And with me being able to tell him, hey, this is how you're going to feel. And him, okay, well, this guy actually knows what he's talking about.
You're a guy in your 20s at this moment in time, right? What, mid to late 20s?
Yes.
And so is he. He's got a couple of years on you, I think, if I'm right. And you said you wanted to train pro athletes. Was he your first pro athlete?
He was my first professional athlete.
This is the craziest story, Tim, right? It really is. This is the craziest story. What I love about it is the letter part, man. That's what people don't understand. I did a bunch of that kind of stuff and met some really interesting people from a similar technique. And people just don't understand that idea of just you having that self-confidence to go give it a shot. Yes, there's some serendipity and it's fortuitous that Michael spotted it, but still, you had to take action.
You have to take action. No one's paying attention to you unless you take action. I have this thing that says, hey, what's the one thing that hasn't gone up in price in the world? Talk. Talk is cheap. It's always going to be cheap. It's the action you put behind that talk. It's the action you put behind your studies. It's the action you put behind your education. It's the action you put behind the action that allows you to get closer to winning. And it was just like, hey, I saw the opportunity. This is what's going to happen. And okay, you know what? I had rather given it my best during this opportunity to try to get whatever was available than to not have even sent those letters and found out somebody else who either sent those letters or ran into them by accident, ended up having the career that I ended up having. That regret would have hurt me more than me not getting the opportunity to work with him, but I know I did everything possible to get to that area.
I still remember your name coming up back in the day, but it was all secretive. Everyone kind of knew that Michael Jordan had this trainer. There was no leaks. No one knew what was going on. It was all kind of like this, who's this guy, Tim, this mystery thing, Jordan's great. Who's the trainer? What's going on?
I didn't speak to the media. I knew my role. My role was like, listen, obviously back then there was no social media, but even if there was social media, I would have not been that person. You could see that even on my social media, it's very rarely do post anything about my clients unless they either tell me to or that there's a reason behind it. To me, the best endorsement you can get is when your athlete talks about you, whenever that is. If he's ever asked, let him explain. My job is to be that person behind the scenes, keep him as healthy as possible, keep him as strong as possible, keep functioning at the highest level, let his results speak for my work. I would just show up, I would do my job. And Michael always had this saying later on in his career, when other athletes would ask if they could work with me, he would say, hey, he goes, listen, I don't pay Tim to train me. He goes, I pay him not to train anyone else.
I caught you saying that on the Skip and Shannon show the other day, and I thought it was great. How quickly did you get beyond with Michael? And I want to talk a little Kobe and perhaps some other clients later in the conversation, but how quickly did you get past only the physical with Michael to the winning mindset conversations with Michael? How did that unfold?
Well, obviously, I had to build a trust. He was extremely competitive. He had his thought process. So people come in as a quote unquote trainer expert. They try to throw everything at an individual. I've always taken things into pieces. I was like, okay, let's figure out something about, let's master one concept first before we delve into the other, So the mindset actually was the last thing I wanted to address. First thing was the physical part. The second thing was the nutrition part. Then the third thing was the mental aspect. As I saw him mastering the physical aspect of it, then we started to put more emphasis on the nutrition part. We started to add that component in there. Then we started to drip the mental component in there. And what I would do is I would watch him. I would watch his body language. I would see I'd ask him how his practice and what went on, because I didn't work for the organization, so I didn't have access to all the practices. So, hey, what happened in practice? He would tell me, hey, how'd you handle this situation? Man, he goes, man, you ask a lot of questions. Yeah, I said, it's important for me to ask these questions so I can get a better understanding of what's going on in your head. I'd watch how he handled the media. I'd watch how he did after a win, after a loss, his tone, how he talked to different teammates. I would ask him questions. Hey, why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? And he would tell me why he did certain situations. I would keep notes of those things. I would point out things like he would handle a situation one way, and I would see how this teammate played and reacted the following game. Then if he handled that same situation in a different way, how that teammate played and handled. And I would ask, hey, what did you say? What did you say to that individual? What did you say to that person? What happened here? And then I will point out, hey, this is the result you got. This is the result you didn't get when you handle this situation one way, when you handle a situation the other way. He would lose his temper in a certain game and how he would react towards the referees or what he would say. I would take and pinpoint everything that happened before and afterwards and see how the psychology of what was going on in his head and the different results he was getting with the different emotions, thoughts, and actions that were going on with all these different things going on. Everyone got a chance to see The Last Dance, and you got to see how competitive he was. So this wasn't always him learning from me. This was a lot of me learning from him and understanding that mindset of that individual, how important winning was to him.
If we keep it at the Pistons for a moment, a big roadblock in his success. And I remember watching all those games and all those series and, especially the early series where the Bulls could not overcome. And, those guys were, I don't want to say anything bad. I enjoy any team that can win. And that was a cohesive Pistons team and they could win, but they played a brand of basketball back there in the late 80s, early 90s that I think if the young kids today had to experience it, they might run off the floor crying. Those guys they were rough and tumble, weren't they?
Yes, they were. They did whatever the rules allowed them to do. Here it was. That's what it was. And they knew there was like, hey, listen, Chuck Daly had a rule. He goes, don't let Michael get airborne. If he gets in the air, we're in trouble. So that was like, hey, knock him on the floor, knock him on his ass, do what he's supposed to do. Make sure every time he comes to the lane, there are many hands on him. Every time there's a foul, make sure there's another foul afterwards. You can't be called for 2 fouls. So there was a strategy that was put into place, and they knew that it's just like boxing. If you continue to take those blows over and over and over again, it is going to take an adverse effect. It is. We had to develop that body and develop those muscles, not to be like a Teflon shield where he could take those blows and not only take those blows, be able to dish it out. And then when the Pistons saw that those blows weren't having the same effect anymore, then the psychological advantage kind of turned to the Bulls' favor.
This winning mindset that you write about, it's so motivational. I mean, anyone with a pulse, even if they can't execute, even if they're just breezily going through your book, when you start to wrap your arms around this winning mindset, it really does energize you. And I think one thing, and I want you to run with this and explain to people, so much we hear in life is all about balance. Okay, you're going to be a super high achiever and you're going to have balance and all this other kind of stuff. How many super high achievers have you met with, quote, balance?
None.
There we go.
Plain and simple, none. And you said high achievers is right there. Now, you'll get individuals who have reached that pinnacle of achievement, and now they have other people doing stuff for them, or they've developed enough wealth or whatever winning means to them, and now they can balance their lives a little bit more because they don't have those things. But nobody wants to talk about the time those high achievers took to get there, how many years and hours and decades they may have sacrificed where they didn't have any balance. Because what happens is, like I said in the book, winning demands obsession, or it'll find someone else to consume. Winning wants all of you. There is no balance. Everybody tells you you need to have more balance. You need to have more balance. You don't find balance. That's the problem. You don't find balance. You create it. You create balance. And what you create balance, and your definition of balance could be completely different than somebody else's. What happens when people tell you you need more balance? Well, you start to add more. You start to add. Everybody says, oh, well, I need more balance. So I need to spend more time here, more time here, more time here. So when somebody says you need more balance, you actually become more unbalanced, because now you're trying to do all these things all over the place. It's like a juggler. I don't juggle, but I know it's a lot easier to juggle 3 things than it is to juggle 30 things. So when people tell you you need more balance, you kind of keep adding stuff, and that's not the way. How do you get closer to the balance that you want to create for yourself? It's not by the addition, it's by the deletion. It's by deleting the unessentials. This is deleting the unessential people in your life. It's deleting the unessential habits. It's deleting the unessential thoughts. It's deleting the unessential actions. It's deleting all these things that you need to do to be able to create that balance, what you want. Remember, time for everything equals time for nothing. Balance is personal. It is personal. You don't want those scales tipping all the way, but you have to decide how much, where it's going to be, how much you want them to tip, where that balance is going to be for that high achiever. There's not a single individual out there. I know it sounds good. I don't talk the rah-rah language. That's not me, because that's not what winning is about. Everybody wants to make it sound good, like you need to have balance in your life in order to achieve these things and all this other stuff. Your greatest winners, your most successful business people, your most successful teachers, your educators, your social workers, whatever it is, they have very low balance in their life.
You could not have known everything you knew back in the day when you first met Michael that you know today. He must have been very comfortable with the idea of betting on you, betting on your energy, knowing that you knew a lot at that moment in time, but he was also betting on, I'm assuming, that you were going to be a constant learner as well.
One of the first things he told me, he said, you better keep up. You better keep up. That wasn't keeping up with him in traffic. That meant keeping up with him in life, keeping up with how things moved, how he studied, how he learned, how his brand grew. It had to be the same way. He adapted to situations. He adapted. He adjusted. He overcame. We all had to do that. And if you couldn't, you were replaced often. And there was many people that were part of his circle that didn't stay in that circle very long because they couldn't keep up. They didn't adjust. They didn't adapt. And we knew every time he won a championship that you had to make another adjustment, because he was going to make an adjustment. And after each championship, he would always come up to me and say, hey, what's next? Because he knew if he came back exactly the same, and as good as he was, if he came back exactly the same, winning was not going to open its doors for him. It was going to be somebody else. So he knew he had to get better. We knew we had to get better. His training had to get better. His mindset had to get better. You know, his schedule, everything had to get better. Everything had to get a little bit better. We knew we had to figure those ways out. If we allowed him to figure those things out, then he isn't allowed to do what he does best. It was our job to figure those things out and implement those things. He put us in a position of trust. He said, I trust you guys to do this stuff. So make sure you get it done. Make sure you stay on top of things. And every now and then he would test. He would say, hey, did you hear so-and-so? I say, yes, I already know it. Or he'll be like, oh, this athlete is doing this. Or have you heard about this method? Already did the research on it, already got it. This is why we would use this. No, this is not, we're going to use this. This is why it's beneficial for this athlete, but it's not beneficial for you. And if we didn't know, this was extremely important with him, the part of being able to keep up. If we didn't know, we didn't guess. We didn't guess. We would say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Because if you're asking somebody a question, they don't need you to guess. They can guess on their own. Have the answer. If you don't know the answer, go find the answer out. Don't BS that person.
I want to go into a little Kobe in a second, but big picture wise, obviously you had a tremendous effect on what other people were seeing. Okay, they see Michael Jordan's results and people want to know who's the trainer he's working with. Speak to just big picture today across pro sports to the extent that you can or want to. How many pro athletes? I mean, the NBA is a pretty rarefied group. What, 300 guys maybe? I mean, these are some of the best athletes on the planet already. Some very natural, kind of born with it. Some work really hard at it. How many guys, or however you want to quantify this, where are we in terms of, if we look at the population of the NBA, guys that are employing the mindset and techniques that you have helped put forward? Do more guys today feel compelled to do it? Or is it there's still a rarefied air of people going all the way with the kind of mindset and techniques that you use?
Well, all the way, not many. There are quite a few players. Maybe every single player at some level is using some kind of outside coach, whether it be a skill coach or maybe a strength and conditioning individual. I'd say that's at a very high percentage. Whether that individual is adapting the program for that person, that I can't say. Now it's become more, who are the results aimed for? Because you get a lot of individuals that the first thing they do is before they even train a client, they already got a picture of that individual up on Instagram. Well, whose brand are you trying to build? Are you worried about the results, or are you trying to build your own brand? What is it? And I understand the trajectory of how people do business now has changed, and people want to get the information out there. But I always say, let the results speak for themselves. The mindset stuff is extremely difficult. And this is a good segue into talking about Kobe, because everybody talked about the mama mentality. And I've said this to more individuals. I said, the mama mentality is not a mentality. It's a lifestyle. All right. And I've seen mama mentality destroy and hinder more careers than it's actually helped.
Define the mama mentality for those that might not be core basketball fans.
Mama mentality is, in a nutshell, a no prisoner mentality. That's what it is. It's just when you're competing, nothing else matters. When you are in that, when you're in your competitive nature, whether it not only in games, whether it's in practice, whether it's just shooting free throws, whatever it is, you are so ultra focused that nothing else matters around you. It's to the point where you are so selfish about winning.
The zone, the flow state.
Yes, it's just those things. And you don't come down to anybody else's level. You make them rise to yours. You don't back down. It's a place where your mind is always stronger than your feelings. It's a huge thing over there. You understand? You don't say something nice to somebody because you don't want to hurt their feelings. It's like, it's truth. It's 100% truth. They always want you to be honest until it's time to be honest with them. You get to a certain point in your career where people are afraid to say no to you, or afraid to say, hey, this is wrong or this is incorrect. There's better ways of handling certain situations. That's what mama mentality is. So people love to say it. They love to hit like one basketball shot or throw one touchdown or whatever it is and say, oh, it's mama mentality. No, mama mentality, you don't talk about mama mentality. You just like, you go out there, you produce the results, you show what you're supposed to do.
What's the root of that in Kobe? Where did that start in him?
So what happened was he was going through a personal issue in his life at a certain stage in his career. And he wanted to create a separate alter ego identity to separate the two of what he was going on in his personal life and what was going on the basketball court. And I talk about this in the book, Winning, the movie Kill Bill. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie, but in the movie, there was an assassin named the Black Mamba. So obviously, if Kobe's looking at something, he's not going to name his alter ego after a garden snake. He's going to name it after the most venomous snake out there. He saw the idea there, and it kind of evolved into this thing of this personality of when I step into practice, when I go to play the games, when I'm on the road, this is the mentality I need to have. When I step in between those lines, this is who I am. It allowed him to focus, like you said, be in that flow state and be that individual where it was no prisoners, no second guessing, knowing that in order to win, that he had to use his heart less. He had to use his mind more, not worry about other people's feelings, didn't care what anybody thought about how he played, what he said, and being able to constantly stay in that flow state that you were talking about.
I still remember some of those Boston series with Kobe. And as a Celtics fan, I was just like, damn, I grudgingly had to admit to myself, this guy is too good. I mean, he was just deadly. You had a nice setup on Michael, but speak to some of that one-on-one with you and Kobe. I mean, I'm not trying to compare and contrast. They've each got hellaciously incredible careers on their own, independently, just different stages and different generations and all that kind of stuff. Speak to your involvement with Kobe, perhaps a contrasted difference, something that was more unique in working with him.
The two biggest differences, I would say, was Michael had full trust in me. He was just like, hey, I hired you, go do what you're supposed to do. I shouldn't have to question you. If I have to question you, just have the right answer, as I mentioned earlier. Kobe wanted to know everything. He wanted to know every single detail. He wanted to know why we were doing this exercise, why we were doing this exercise in this particular order. Why am I eating this thing? Why do you have me taking a nap at this time? He wanted to know every single detail.
His questioning probably made you better, though, huh?
It did make me better. I don't mind that. If I'm going to challenge you, you have the right to challenge me. Every single thing. And here's the thing. If I can't explain to you why we're doing something and why I have you thinking this way, or why I have you eating something, or why I'm having you doing this exercise, why I don't have you doing this exercise, we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be doing it. There's a reason behind every single thing. And that reason is to get you a step closer to your next win. Challenge me all you want. And this was a way for him also to see, am I developing a program that was a Kobe Bryant program and not what a Michael Jordan program was? Yeah, there were pieces and foundations that were crossed. He wanted to make sure I wasn't just taking what Michael did, because his body type was different. His gameplay, the way he played was different. I wasn't just taking what worked for one individual and trying to force it onto him. And he would ask, he goes, hey, did you have Michael do this thing? But I would say, yes, I had Michael do this. Or no, I didn't have him do this. Yeah, I had Michael do this way, but I'm having you doing this way. This is why I have you eating this. And I had Michael eating this because your metabolic rates are different in different stages of your careers and everything. This is why I want you thinking about these things. I had Michael thinking about other things over here. There was a reason behind everything.
God, the preparation, I can think back to when you first met Michael and then meeting Kobe, other athletes, but the preparation, I mean, you're not making it sound easy, but there is a heck of a lot of preparation for you in particular when you're dealing with individuals that are at this particular level. There's no faking it. I mean, you've got to be so prepared. I could just imagine you must have been burning the midnight oil, so to speak, in terms of your preparation every time you dealt with another high achiever in terms of professional athletes.
I burned through so much midnight oil, I think I might have caused some of the gas prices to go up. I had no choice. Going back to Michael early in his career, I always tell people I was the original Fitbit. So what I would do is I'd go to the game. I was blessed enough to go to majority of the games. I could watch the games, but I couldn't pay attention to the details that I wanted to. For our younger viewers, they're going to have no idea what I'm talking about here. There was these machines called Betamaxes and VHS recorders that you would actually record a game on. I would set that up to record the game. So then after the games, I would come home because I knew the workout for the next morning. I had to rewatch the game because I had to count all of MJ's steps. I had to count how many steps he took to the left, how many steps he took to the right, backwards, forward, sideways, how many jumps he did. Because if I didn't have that information, I wasn't prepared for the next workout tomorrow, because I needed to know if one side was more fatigued than the other, that the right knee and the right ankle and the right hip take more stress than the left. And what parts, there was a part that he fell, and how did, what happened after that? So I literally would come home, it would be about a midnight, sit there, watch all the games again, do all the details, and then have to be back at Michael's the next morning, depending on what time the workout was. And the workouts were usually at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., or 7 a.m. So I would literally be going on anywhere from 3 to 4 hours sleep at the most.
I got kind of a side tangent question here before I bring it back to something that Kobe said. But in working with pro athletes, especially, let's say, the NBA guys up and down the court, who knows how many miles they're running in a game, is it possible for these guys to get to their 50s and 60s and still be not physically damaged? They're giving it all during their 20s and 30s, and it's kind of like no prisoner, and they kind of lose something.
100%. If you see a professional athlete in their 50s and 60s, listen, obviously stuff is changing now, but still, if you've given it all for 15, 20 years, there is going to be a body part or body parts that you're not going to be able to walk straight. Your fingers aren't going to be straight. Your wrists, your elbows, your shoulders, your knees. There is going to be a detriment to something physically. If you're giving everything you got, if you're literally playing and practicing at the highest level. I have some of the top conditioned athletes that played the most amount of games in their career. And I don't have not one that doesn't have a issue after they retired. The crazy part about all this is we paid particular attention to all the areas that have a tendency to get injured. We paid attention to the ankles. We paid attention to the wrists, the fingers, just things that nobody else would think about. There's still physical issues with them.
I love this line from Kobe. It's on the first page of your book, and I don't think I've seen it before. I mean, I guess I should have seen it before, but rest at the end, not in the middle. And that gets back to some of the mindset stuff at the beginning of our conversation. But I thought that's a good philosophical jumping off point as you and I wind down. Rest at the end, not in the middle. I guess a lot of people can interpret that in many ways. Why don't you give the Kobe interpretation and you can add some context and color to it?
Well, you know what? This fits in real good with the second to last chapter in the book where it says winning's not a marathon, it's a sprint with no finish line. A lot of individuals think they have the luxury of taking their time. You don't have the luxury of taking your time. You just don't, because time is something that we have no idea when it's going to be taken away from us. So when you get a lot of individuals that just kind of like are in cruise control, yeah, you know what, I got time, I'll have time to figure this out and so forth. Those individuals are constantly managing time. They're the individuals that manage time. The one thing we did with all our athletes and the whole idea about resting at the end and not resting in the middle, start managing focus. Because when you start managing focus, you have so much more time. Oh, just think about when you're in that state where you're so focused, how much more you can get done during that time when you're managing that focus instead of managing time. And people that manage your time all the time, they love to rest in the middle. They're always like, oh, it's a break time here, I can take a little. Now, I'm not telling you, listen, you need to rejuvenate. You need to get distracted a little bit. You need to let the mind rest. You need to re-energize physically and mentally. But don't stay in that rest state for a long period of time. The people that stay in that rest state for a long period of time don't have the ability to finish. They don't have the ability to win because they have a tendency to get comfortable. We used to talk about this all the time is, everyone says, it's about the journey. Yeah, it is about the journey, but the journey has to have a destination. It has to have a destination. These individuals, they enjoyed the journey, but each one of their journeys had a destination. And that destination allowed them to rest at the end of that journey because they knew the next journey was going to start back up again. So for individuals that are out there, if you want to put something together with that line where it says, hey, rest at the end, not in the middle, start managing focus and stop managing time.
What's so cool about your work, your book, your books, several books, is that this winning mindset, too many people, maybe they get out of high school and they move into just a regular job or whatever, and they lose the feeling of what winning is about. They don't have anything in their life where they're competing still. It's like the spring unwinds. The only reason I wake up every day is I'm chasing a win. I'm chasing a win. If I'm not chasing a win, what am I doing? I mean, I wake up every day energized to work on the stuff that I'm working on. I am chasing a win every damn day, every day. I can't turn it off. But I think too many people, and you know this more than I, too many people lose that. They don't have it. I do think your book is a great reminder of folks that, and regardless of how old they are, I love finding those YouTube videos of there's two guys like 100 years old running 100-meter dashes in under 20 seconds.
Oh, I love those things too. Yes.
Those are great. That stuff is great, you know? Speak to that issue though, of like people that perhaps think, well, you know, I'm past it. I can't do this. I mean, they really can do it. They just need a swift kick and then you know what?
Those individuals, and this happens at a lot of stages in people's lives. When did you quit? When did you give up? What made you give up? What made you quit? That's what you have to address. That's what you have to address, because the ability to win is in all of us. Winning is everywhere. It's every minute you have the opportunity to win. I also think a lot with everything that's been going on in the world these last year and a half, 2 years, whatever it was. People forgot what a win looks like. They forgot what it feels like. They've forgotten and they've gotten comfortable. They've gotten comfortable making excuses. They've gotten comfortable blaming somebody else. They're looking for their wins to wear a halo all the time, and winning doesn't wear a halo all the time. A lot of the times it comes at you with fangs. Just like what you said, you get up every single morning excited. You get up every single morning excited to, hey, listen, what's the next win I can get? You're not looking for steps. You're not looking for the easiest way. You're not looking for 5 easy steps to get this win or 5 steps to greatness. You're not looking for 10 steps to super mindset. Those individuals that lose it, they're constantly looking for the easiest way. They're constantly looking for that one thing. How many times, Michael, do you get asked all this time, if you could give me one piece of advice? God, don't we wish it was that easy? If it was just one piece of advice. Those pieces of advice are infinite. Those steps are also infinite. They're constantly shifting. They're constantly changing. Sometimes you see them under your feet. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you can't even walk up those steps. What happens is the ones that give up, they're looking to constantly walk up those steps, or they're looking for an escalator to carry them. And they just don't understand that sometimes you got to sit on those steps. You got to crawl on those steps. You got to fall down those steps. So they're just like, you know what? I just don't want to do this today. And then today turns into tomorrow, the next day, the next day, the next day, the next day. Winning requires you to show up every single day. It doesn't care about what happened yesterday. It could care less what had happened a year ago. It could care less about what happened 10 years ago. And too many times people get comfortable and they use their surroundings, their environments, their past, their present situation as excuses that allow them to put themselves in a comfort zone of always being a victim instead of being the victor.
Someone can't win for you. You've got to go win it. You can't hire someone to win for you.
Your obligation has to be greater than anybody else's obligation to you.
The book, Winning, The Unforgiving Race to Greatness. Motivational stuff. It's nighttime for me here in Asia, so now you've got me all jacked up. I will not be able to fall asleep.
Where are you?
I'm in Saigon, Vietnam.
Oh my goodness. How long you been there?
8 years. I was randomly living in San Diego, got invited on a speaking tour for one of my books, and I loved Asia. And I said, well, gosh, I was in 20 cities in a 3-month stretch, and I had the most fun in Saigon. So I said, I'm going to stay.
That's winning. That's winning. That is. How many people have come up to you and says, man, I could never do that. Or like, man, I wish I could do that. Well, why didn't you? You did it.
I think you make an interesting point there, and I'm sure you could compare it to many other things. When it happens, you have to go. When it's go time and you see it, You can't hesitate. You must take it. Like you said, okay, you'll get too comfortable. You forget about it. You make excuses, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a great point, and I'll end with this. In the book, you said, listen, we're all going to have fear, but you can't have doubt. You had fear. You're like, do I really want to do this? But you didn't have any doubt that it was the right situation to you. Winning requires you to have no doubt.
That's a great one. Again, the book, Winning, The Unforgiving Race to Greatness. Tim, the book is everywhere, all that kind of fun stuff. Lots of great interviews that I've seen with you for this book. Where can we send people? Is there a website you want to direct them to?
I'm the easiest person to find. My website is timgrover.com, and my Instagram is @TimGrover.
Tim, cool stuff. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.